Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Daniel Estulin. Welcome to our show on my English language channel, estulin.media. Well, actually, it's on YouTube English language channel. And the series is called World at Large. We've been demonetized, as I said a few times already in the past. And this is a way for us to get our audience back. So it's a kind of a daily commentary on current events. So I want to start with the first order of business. And the question is NATO preparing for war, and if they are, how? I think the example of NATO clearly shows the crisis in governance. Now, Russia openly considers NATO a participant in the war in Ukraine, I think for obvious reasons. And the war is in its third year. It started in February 2022. In fact, it's almost 3 years old. And all this time, for the past almost 3 years, NATO countries have been actively helping Ukraine. There's no doubt about that. And so, after 3 years of war, it's kind of strange to hear from NATO General Secretary Rutte, politicians from Germany, from France, and Holland, that NATO needs to increase military production. And immediately after these statements were made, as if on cue, Great Britain, which says that military production needs to be increased. But this is empty rhetoric because UK cannot even maintain the production that already exists. And as a result, London is forced to reduce the existing armed forces to a bare minimum. And also recently, just came out a few weeks ago, it turned out that two of Britain's newest aircraft carriers are not only absolutely useless at wartime, after spending billions of dollars on them, but they cannot even protect themselves from enemies' attacks. And then Rutte makes an even stranger statement. Now, according to Rutte, Russia is NATO's main adversary, and it is quite possible, according to him, that NATO alliance will be forced to enter into a direct confrontation with Russia in the near future. And at the same time, a statement is made that NATO is absolutely not ready for this war. Now, the number of shells in the warehouses is close to minimum standards. Most of the ammunition has already been sent to Ukraine. And now it turns out that the recently created Finnish Baltic bridgehead has practically nothing to defend, and there is not even a guarantee of the successful defense of Poland and Romania. These are key strategic perimeter areas of NATO defense. And so a very reasonable question arises. What level of mismanagement is required for these problems to come up in the third year of the war? Or I should say almost in the fourth. So as an example, Russia in February 2022, as it turned out, was completely unprepared for the war in Ukraine. Now, Moscow believed its own propaganda and compared the Soviet Red Army that had defeated Hitler and Nazi Germany 80 years ago to Russia's post-Soviet 21st century armed forces. But this unpreparedness became clear only 2 weeks after the start of the conflict. And Rutte makes such conclusions not 2 weeks after the start of the war, but 2.5, almost 3 years after it began. And this is an example of crisis in management. Now, Donald Trump, having familiarized himself with the state of affairs in NATO, now wondered whether the United States of America really needs to be in NATO in the first place. I don't think anybody really believes that the United States will leave NATO, and in fact, it's unlikely to happen. But the discussion of this topic in itself is an admission of the management crisis that makes NATO completely dependent on the United States. I want to remind you that NATO was created during the Cold War and is based on the memory of the results of World War II. And before World War II, it was not possible to create a similar structure. Because Holland and Belgium, for example, they insisted on their neutrality. So a more effective defense alliance was concluded only between England and France, which turned out to be completely insufficient to hold the Western Front against Nazi Germany. And so NATO was created as a kind of a collective defense scheme, an event of an attack by the Soviet Union. Because NATO is it's a system of collective security, a system of mutual agreements, if you wish, on the conduct of hostilities, and more importantly, on relatively cheap defense. And so this cheapness is generated by the division of labor in common defense and the introduction of uniform standards, for example, in the military-industrial complex, which provides interchangeability of the entire line of weapons of NATO member countries. You just change one country for another, the same weapons, the same system. And so 2% of GDP is a fairly cheap level of maintaining the armed forces in their readiness. And countries, for example, that do not have such standardization under conditions are forced to spend 3 or 4 times more, between 6 and 8% on defense. Russia, for example, right now is spending 25% of its GDP. But then NATO faced simple but interesting problems. For example, NATO was prepared based on the experience of World War II for non-nuclear combat operations. And it was assumed that NATO structures are designed for a non-nuclear war, and a nuclear war is a war between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And so from this point of view, the United States being part of NATO does not solve the problem of European defense, since even with the use of air mobile armed forces, it will take quite a bit of time to deliver American troops to the area of operations. And therefore, it was believed that the United States supports NATO troops in case of a nuclear conflict. Because the United States is a fleet, it's a nuclear force, it's aviation of various levels, from tactical to strategic aviation. And today it's absolutely clear why NATO needs the United States, but it's much more difficult to answer the second question. Does the United States need NATO? Because in the event of a nuclear war, NATO's role will be close to zero. Yes, you could say that Britain and France have their own nuclear weapons, but if you compare them to the United States, and even if you compare them to Russia, which is the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, this is pittance. And so in the event of a non-nuclear war in Europe, or with the use of tactical nuclear weapons, it's much more advantageous for the United States to have the freedom of action. In other words, to be out of NATO. They can threaten Russia by entering the war on the side of Europe, and on the other hand, they have the leverage over Europe by threatening them not to enter the war with Russia, depending on what the United States needs. And so it's important to understand that the United States has always proceeded from the position of two important strategies. On the one hand, this is a strategy going back to the 19th century, to the 1830s, the Monroe Doctrine, according to which the United States should primarily prevail in the Western Hemisphere, and what happens in Europe concerns them very little. And the second policy, that in order to protect the Eastern Hemisphere, it is necessary to have remote military bases there. And so from these bases, it's possible to intervene in any part of the world, in any conflict the world over. And so over the past 20 years, due to globalization, the United States of America has deindustrialized itself. And now, just like Europe and almost the rest of the world, has an acute shortage of production capability. And also, if you add to the fact that the United States has a negative trade balance, Washington can survive due to the fact that the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. But today, you see, the question arises whether the dollar will remain so. Most likely it will remain so, but the risks for this are already emerging. And so in this case, the United States finds itself in an extremely difficult situation, because on the one hand, they will not have enough finance, and on the other hand, there will be a shortage of industrial capacity for the rapid deployment of military production. For example, everything that is made in industry is 80% made of iron and steel. And in the military industrial complex, it's probably about 95%. Now, the United States still has a decent metallurgy production, but it has fallen by 20% over the past 20 years. And during this time, many new metallurgical enterprises have been closed. And now the United States production is about 100 million tons per year, and China, that's 800 million tons. And so Trump, of course, as a businessman, he understands that the United States cannot wage two wars at the same time. Well, Europe, in fact, is incapable of waging one war. And this is, for the United States, if we're speaking of a war, they're not going to fight European war. Their war is the Civil War. And so it's much more important for Trump to solve domestic problems now. He's not very or at all interested in whether Ukraine will become Russian or Chinese, or even whose Germany or France will be, since it doesn't really matter much to the United States whether the French and the Germans will be Russian or the Chinese. Well, that's bad, but not so bad as to once again postpone an inevitable internal conflict, meaning a war between the states during which a completely different industry and different scale of money will be discussed. And so in this regard, the United States' transition to the Monroe Doctrine in foreign policy is very likely. And Trump's message is clear. We're not interested in the whole world at this point. Maybe later, maybe, but not today. Not until we solve our own immediate internal contradictions. And then it's quite possible that we will leave NATO, period. And so at the same time, we must take into account that the United States has been in NATO for more than 70 years, and it's easy to declare it withdrawal from the alliance, but it's very difficult to do so in real terms. And so therefore, I'm inclined to think that things will be done differently. At first, the internal conflict will escalate, and only when it becomes severe enough, then the United States can announce not a withdrawal from NATO, but a suspension of its participation. And again, I'm not the only one who thinks this. What I just said has already been communicated to Trump in a much harder terms from some of his closest military advisors. And therefore, the next question will be the level of his decisiveness. Now, again, I want to remind you that in January 2021, Trump chickened out, and we know what happened. And so this time his maneuverability is severely restricted by the current global crisis. And finally, in the absence of the United States, NATO becomes an ineffective structure in the conditions of a European war. And so either the alliance must drastically restructure and significantly increase its share of funding, otherwise the structure will be, again, largely paper-based. And hence the talk in Europe that funding needs to be increased, but there's no money for this. And so Europe, in the event of the US leaving NATO and in the absence of a victory in Ukraine, during which Russia once again becomes a formidable foe, has no good strategy to speak of, and there's no time to reorganize it. Again, it's too late. Because the point of no return was passed in the summer of 2023 when the failed Ukrainian offensive, and Europe, as the saying goes, find itself between the rock and the hard place with a snowball's chance in hell of wiggling out of this thing alive. Okay, so that's on the one hand. Speaking of conspiracies, so we have the UFOs or whatever it is flying over most of the United States. Nobody seems to know what it is. And by the way, the notorious Lee Harvey Oswald had nothing to do with Kennedy's assassination, which just celebrated the 60th anniversary of his assassination, November 22nd. 1963. And so after 60 years of this cover-up, I think it's fairly clear to all, okay, that the lone gunman theory is a crock of shit. And of course we have the P. Diddy thing with celebrities, scared shitless of the fallout once Trump becomes president of the United States. And some of them already left for the United States and have resettled in France and Italy and Spain and Australia, even Canada. Imagine this going to Canada. And of course, European politicians, they're panicking, to say the least. Trump is a wild card. He's being extremely nice to them all. Macron, Scholz, the spineless PM of England, Zelensky. But I think the question most of them or all of them are asking is Trump being sincere, smiling, buddy, shaking hands, or is he simply biding his time waiting for the 20th of January? And so a few weeks ago, spineless coward, Chancellor of Germany, Scholz, he called Putin for the first time since the war began. And they talked for an hour without a translator because Putin's German is fluent. Now, in an hour, you can discuss a lot of things. Because the panic we're seeing within the political circles of the European Union, because the question is, why would he call now? And so again, the panic we're seeing within the political circles of the European Union, London, Brussels, And most importantly, in the liberal circles of the United States of America, it's an indicator of things to come. And by the way, Russia's central bank, which represents one of the networks, namely the liberal American network of the Democratic Party in Russia, is doing its utmost to destroy Russia's economy before Trump becomes president of the United States. In other words, the central theme that Putin needs to be deposed, and for this, it's necessary to orchestrate an uprising in Russia. And the way to do this is by destroying the people's livelihood, raising the interest rates to 27%. And that has, again, become the central theme on the minds of this team, which can be conditionally called the Moore-Burns group, in other words, MI6, CIA. And by the way, those still in charge in Washington, we can conditionally call them the deep state. They're fully aware that this so-called opposition to dictators, quote unquote, in other words, any government not in line with the diktats of the deep state, be it Russia, China, Belarus, Georgia, Romania, Moldova, it doesn't matter. Venezuela, whoever that may be, which is, again, all of these are being financed, these movements, by the deep state, MI6, CIA, both in Europe, in the United States, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and so forth, obviously America. Okay, so this group of individuals who oppose the legitimate governments have no authority, no legitimacy, no independent position, and nothing at all is of no interest, and it needs to be dealt with in the sense of ending, since there is no sense in keeping this thing going. Because once Trump gets in, he's going to go after these people because they are not only anti-Russia, anti-Georgia, but they represent the interests of Trump's enemies, and thus they must be dealt with. In other words, they'll be exterminated. And so if they don't hurry up, in other words, this CIA MI6, Moore-Burns group will not have the time to organize a large-scale war in the Middle East or to avoid Trump's leaving, not only Ukraine, saying, see ya, but also Europe in general, the same way Americans left Afghanistan. After which the entire system, their system, will collapse. And at the same time, this group, for its own survival, they will need financial dividends after the crisis. And the initial idea was to divide Ukraine amongst themselves, thus, the deals with the BlackRock, Vanguard Group, having signed with Zelensky for controlling the best agricultural lands in the country. But this will only work, I repeat, it will only work if Ukraine wins the war or has something to negotiate with. And the way things look right now, they will be lucky if they'll have whatever is left of the country they can actually call Ukraine, because what left of Ukraine will be tiny fragment. And so the elite, having clearly chosen Western Europe as an alternative, they need to fight to survive. And for this reason, this pampering by Scholz is quite dangerous, because they're desperate, which means they have little to lose and they may go for broke. And going for broke means anything from a dirty bomb to a limited usage of nuclear weapons. So what are some of these key conclusions we can draw from this story? Well, the first is that this MI6 CIA group, which still has very powerful resources the world over, and especially in Russia, through Russia's central bank, they have already realized, that it's all or nothing time. That's the first conclusion. And the second conclusion is that they, in general, no longer regard Biden as some kind of a sacred figure of the President of the United States of America, firstly, because he will cease to be president in 1 month, and secondly, if need to, they will sacrifice him if it seems expedient enough. What do I mean? Sacrifice him, kill him, and blame some crazy extremist for his death. And finally, thirdly, they in general realize that if they do nothing, then by mid-January, their chance of survival, I repeat, not of losing power because Trump will become president on 20th of January, not talking about losing power, but of survival, physical survival, are practically zero. And therefore, they have no choice but to go for broke. And so what makes it most dangerous and unpredictable is the level of desperation. And so we need to be prepared for this. And so finally, I will say that one fundamentally important thing that many still do not understand. These people, doesn't matter if I'm talking about CIA, MI6, more the Donald Trump, and many others, smaller participants in all of these games, they do not understand. They have a hunch that by fall 2025, things will be much better, and economically speaking, the crisis will end, they will turn the corner, and everything is going to be hunky-dory. And this is why they're going for broke, clearly believing that this calamitous, disastrous economic situation in the country will soon become much better, but they're wrong. This is only the beginning of this uncontrollable chaos awaiting us around the corner. Again, watch what's happening very carefully. The number of provocations will only increase until mid-January, maybe even the end of January, with Trump already president of the United States, and they will get stronger and stronger, these provocations, and affect more and more people in more and more countries. For example, Trump's candidate for Attorney General, Gates, how will you pronounce his name, withdrew his candidacy a few weeks ago. It doesn't matter what the reason is, because he realized the Senate would definitely not approve it. And this is important. And this shows that Trump will not be able to form the government he wants. And other candidates opposed to the deep state will also be blocked. The Senate, which is the Republican Party of the United States of America, Trump's party, well, they have a majority in the Senate. That's supposedly a good thing. But the majority of senators, they do not support Trump on many issues because they're never Trumpers. The confrontation in the United States is not along the lines of Republican Party, Democratic Party. You have many Republicans who are against Donald Trump, and many Democrats have gone over to Donald Trump, like Kennedy and Gabbard, for example. And so the split in the United States is not, again, along the lines Democratic, Republican, but deep state system of bureaucratic networks versus American society, deplorables, patriots, Trump as the spokesman for the demands of this part of the American society. Because again, the Senate is mostly on the side of the deep state. Now, the deep state did not allow Donald Trump to pursue his policies the first term. And needless to say, they're going to try to repeat this trick the second time around as well. More precisely, they want to allow Trump to pursue his policies regarding, for example, the economy in China, and not allow him regarding the liberal agenda, LGBT, globalization, Europe, Russia. On migrants, drugs, that's debatable, needs to be seen. And so blocking Gates is a defeat for Trump, and they will beat him again. And I personally think that Gabbard will not be approved either. So I have a few very interesting months coming up. So on that we end. Again, join us on our YouTube channel, okay? And if you're interested, sign up. Make sure you follow us. And also on my page, Estulin.media, we have a lot of content. All of the content is both in English and in Spanish. We have weekly intelligence conceptual analysis, which is about 45, 50 minutes of global analysis from a conceptual point of view. And also we have weekly interviews, over 350 interviews with some of the leading politicians, economists, scientists, philosophers, leading thinkers the world over. The last one we had was last week, General Michael Flynn. So on that we end. Again, join us at Estulin.media and certainly follow us on our channel, YouTube, Daniel Estulin. Thanks, and until tomorrow, goodbye.